Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our half-day conference, Get Ready to Rank, which is our conference on everything ranked choice voting. My name is Debbie Lewis, and I led the education and outreach efforts in New York City under Rank the Vote NYC, which is a project of Common Cause New York. And I will be your moderator for today. I hope you all enjoyed that very special networking session, and we'll have time to do a little bit more of that. And now we're going to begin our first panel. And I will read the bios of all of the individuals who you'll be hearing from today. We have 2 panel sessions. We will have a short break, and then we will jump into breakout rooms, which will be held on Zoom. A link will go out for that. You will have time for a break and a time to transition into Zoom, right? Now, I know switching to another platform is not ideal, but you definitely don't want to miss it because you'll be hearing from experts and talking to them one-on-one about what happened or what they know about RCV, whether it's messaging, building voter education, legislative agendas, et cetera, right? And so now, without further ado, I just want to make sure that everyone can see and hear very quickly. Maybe I should have started with that. Can you just navigate to the right side of your screen and give me a thumbs up if you can see and hear well? Perfect. Okay. And so we will begin with our first panel, and I will invite them up after we read their bios. So our first 2 speakers, Sandy Ma, the Executive Director for Common Cause Hawaii. Sandy leads campaigns, fundraising, and engages in local, state, and national organizations and building coalitions around Hawaii. She focuses on ethics and accountability, money and influence, and voting as well as elections. She is leading a campaign to bring ranked choice voting to Hawaii. We can't wait to hear more about her efforts and what she's doing in Hawaii to bring ranked choice voting there. And to join Sandy, we will have Sean Dugar. He is a political and nonprofit consultant with nearly 2 decades of experience. He has managed campaigns for candidates running for office in ranked choice voting in California's Bay Area. Sean joined More Voice DC as its founding executive director after successfully helping implement RCV in New York City as Rank the Vote New York City's education campaign program director. And without further ado, I will have Sean and Sandy begin the first panel. And this panel, first panel, let's see if we can get Sandy on. This first panel, the topic will be gaining RCV. So how to get and build RCV in your jurisdiction. Sean and Sandy, the floor is all yours. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great.
Awesome. Aloha. Thank you for having us here to talk about gaining RCV.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing all this wonderful information that we're about to get into. I think we will start with Sean, since you have pretty much done this a couple times. You're not new to this show. So if you just want to talk a little bit about your experience with gaining or implementing RCV in various jurisdictions, and then we'll jump over to Sandy.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. As you said, I've been around the block a bit in this RCV space. First, being an early supporter of RCV and the initiative to get RCV in Oakland, my hometown, as well as Berkeley. and then becoming an RCV voter and getting to experience the ranking process myself, helping candidates in RCV races, and then being called upon to travel the country and share my experiences advocating in support of RCV, as well as leading public education campaigns. And now the campaign to get RCV, the legislative campaign to implement RCV and get it passed here in DC. So I'm excited to share those experiences with you all. My main thing, and probably the key thing I want you all to take away, is community and coalitions matter. Quite often, the folks that are mobilizing RCV to get RCV implemented or passed face challenges because they don't mobilize and engage coalition partners early in the process. Quite often, we don't have that power mapping session and bring people in who may be on the fence early so that they feel that they have a say in RCV policies and democracy policies, but are usually brought in later after the policy has been developed and are told, take it or leave it. And more often than not, unfortunately, they leave it and become the opposition. So engaging folks early on is very important, making sure that your coalition looks like the voting community. Yes, making sure your coalition looks like the people that it's going to be engaging and needing votes from. The other thing is there is this, I haven't been able to understand it, but there is this thought of being nonpartisan to an extent in partisan. So I'm from the Bay Area of California. I'm in the bluest district, in the bluest state in the country. Yet so often our reform family talks about empowering other parties and other communities, when the reality is you need pretty much one party behind you in order to get something passed. And if you're bringing in others, that raises red flags for that party. And so really figuring out, and again, power mapping and strategic planning on who you absolutely need to be behind you and who you can afford or not afford to have as your opposition. I have to give a shout out to folks from San Diego who recently sat down with members of the Democratic Party and were able to work out the language within the measure that they're going to be pushing so that the party wasn't in opposition and had buy-in. And again, that goes back to engaging folks early so that you have a diverse coalition that looks like the voting community, that looks like the political leadership that you want to have on your side. So I know my time is coming up, but I would say those are key to developing a strong coalition to get RCV passed in your communities.
Sean, I just have one quick question before we jump to Sandy. What messaging have you found that has been effective, especially with dealing with opposition?
So I think knowing what their narrative is going to be early on is key. Usually it's the same 3 points that people won't understand it, and that usually translates to seniors won't understand it or people of color won't understand it. I think we have the data from every single jurisdiction that has implemented ranked choice voting that says otherwise. Second is that it's too costly. And the reality is the tabulation software can be as cheap as free. And so the cost really usually comes in on the education side. And, there should always be money for education. Education is key. And so, yes, you want to spend more money on education, and anyone who opposes that just looks silly. So those are two key points.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Uh, just a quick reminder, if you have any comments, you can drop it in the chat. And if you do have a question for the panelists, we will have a Q&A after this first panel session. And you can drop that question in the Q&A feature, which is to the right of the chat button. Okay. So Sandy, I know right now Hawaii is currently in the process of talking or in talks of bringing RCV there. How have you found your strongest sponsors, and how are you building support?
Thank you for that question, Debbie. And first, I want to thank Sean for that really informative discussion about building coalitions, and that is incredibly important. And so I want to applaud Sean for educating all of us about the importance of coalition building to adopt RCV. And so to get to Debbie's question about legislatively passing RCV and how we have found our supporters, I'd like to take a step back and talk about Hawaii's political landscape. Hawaii is one of the bluest states in the nation. We have traditionally had Democratic governors and Democratic lieutenant governors, and we have a 76 member state legislature. We have 25 senators, only one is Republican. We have 51 House members, and only 4 are Republican. And so with this overwhelming blue state, a lot of our voters feel, why vote? We have one of the lowest voter turnouts in the nation. We have one of the lowest voter registration rates in the nation. There is a sense of, if you have a D next to your name, you're going to be elected in office. And so there's a real sense of, why should we even vote in Hawaii? Because you're a Democrat, you're going to get elected. And we have a lot of pro-voter reforms. We have passed automatic voter registration in our last session. We have same-day voter registration. We have online voter registration. Let's see, we have all vote by mail, but still our voter registration rate is low, and our voter turnout is low. And this makes it, it's actually quite kind of difficult in the Hawaii landscape. It is not something to be proud of in Hawaii. So what we hold out for ranked choice voting is that even though you have access to the ballot, it is not meaningful access, and that you don't have a real choice. And that's what we see ranked choice voting will be. It gives people a choice. It's not just, if you have a D next to your name, you're going to get elected. It really gives people a choice for who you vote for. You get to rank your elect people who are running for office. So it's a real meaningful choice. And that's how we explain ranked choice voting, that it's, you don't have to vote for one person. It's not just a foregone conclusion. It's a real meaningful choice. And that's how we start building our support for ranked choice voting in the community. That's how we like to try to expand and try to educate people as to why ranked choice voting is important. And so for those people who are in office, we try to let people know that ranked choice voting will really improve Hawaii's voter turnout and Hawaii's just make Hawaii not so the worst in the nation in terms of voter turnout and people who are registered to vote. I'm not quite sure I answered all of your question, Debbie. I could certainly answer more.
No, that was really good. Thank you for that. I just have a follow-up question to or a point and one follow-up question to something you said, where RCV gives people a choice. And I think that is something in our, I would say, across all every single state, that people need to understand with ranked choice voting. It's no more picking the lesser of two evils, right? You have a choice to pick multiple candidates in order of your preference. And that is some of the language that we used in New York City, which people really gravitated towards. And so I really like that you all are using that as well as part of your messaging for Hawaii. As far as legislatively, what are some areas of concerns that you have seen from your legislators, and how are you dealing with that?
So yes, so some of the concerns that legislators have raised is exactly like Sean has said. Well, it's confusing to voters. It is very confusing to voters. People have raised that issue a lot, and how we've addressed that is education. We are totally on board with public education. And what we see is that Susan has dropped in the chat the argument that won't it scare incumbents in the legislature. And what we are proposing for our ranked choice voting legislative push is a smaller ranked choice voting bill, kind of like a pilot ranked choice voting bill, which is to focus on special federal elections and special vacant county council seats. And we have seen in some elections that for special federal elections, there have been a lot of candidates running for special federal elections, which have caused a split of the vote, and people winning a special federal election by 30% of the votes, and it doesn't really represent the will of the people. And so it has split the vote. There have been like 6 candidates running, and candidates get like 10, 12, 20, 30% of the votes, and then winning office with like 30% of the vote in a special federal election. And so we've seen that also happen in special vacant county council seats, where there have been like 12 candidates running in vacant county council seats. And so state elected officials at the legislature are more inclined to try a limited ranked choice bill for just special vacant county council elections and special federal elections.
Debbie, if I can add on to that.
Yeah.
There are some incumbents that understand these issues, right? In DC, our primary author of the VOICE Act, which is the RCV legislation, was elected last year out of a field of 24 candidates. And she only won with 14% of the vote. And she's very clear and very public in that means that 85% of voters didn't get to have their voice heard in the final results of that election. And so having ranked choice voting fixes that. It gives her actually more of a mandate and more of a cushion in how she legislates, because she'll know she has the majority of voters with her. And so that has been a key talking point in how we're talking to and addressing some of the legislators and council members here in DC.
That's awesome. Speaking of messaging, if you were to identify 2 top persuasive reasons for adopting RCV, what would those be? And Sean, since you're unmute, you can answer that, and then Sandy can.
So one is, if you're in a location where you're getting rid of your primary, so you're moving it using it in the general election, the cost savings. Or if you're in a place that has runoff elections, the overall cost savings is something that appeals to people of all parties. So no matter if you're in a red area, a blue area, everybody likes to save money. Um, B is that it allows voters to have their voice heard, fully heard in the process. Quite often we hear about voter intimidation and voter suppression, but the reality is that voters not having their voice heard in the final results of an election, especially when it's something as extreme as 85% of voters, that means that their voice is being suppressed in the process. And ranked choice voting is how we fix that.
In Hawaii, where we're trying to move a limited ranked choice voting bill, we had a couple of federal elections, special federal elections, and it is very important to Hawaii to build seniority in Congress. We are a small state, and with our special federal elections, we had people elected by that were not able to win re-election. Um, and given that they were not able to, without ranked choice voting, uh, is our position, because the votes were split. I don't think I'm saying that very clearly. Because there were so many candidates running, the votes were split, and people were not able to get enough votes after they got into office to secure re-election. And so ranked choice voting can really ensure that the people's will and their voices are heard properly the first time around. So our special elections do not call for a further election. It's just winner take all. And so that is really important to us to build seniority in in Congress. And so that is very important. And and in a and in our Bacon County Council elections, again, a lot of people were running for office in this one particularly contested race, and it split the votes so much that a Tea Party Republican, I know we're nonpartisan, a Tea Party Republican got into office, and it really uh, uh, made the functioning of the county council very difficult to have a smooth county council function properly. So people were very concerned about how the county council can function smoothly. And so at ranked choice voting, people are very interested in seeing that adopted.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Really quick before we move on to Q&A, what tools have you used, Sandy, so far in your efforts to implementing ranked choice voting in Hawaii? What has been useful and effective? What are you looking to use to continue your efforts?
Sean has talked about, we do engage with coalitions to try to build support and momentum for ranked choice voting in Hawaii. I have to say, during the pandemic, it has been incredibly difficult to meet with partners one-on-one. You do need that kind of face-to-face rapport building. So I have to say, during the pandemic, it has been difficult to do that. We are meeting with legislators by Zoom remotely to talk about the need for ranked choice voting. And we do stress that this is a limited ranked choice voting bill that we are pushing at this point to try to build understanding in the community of how the ranked choice voting ballot will work and what it looks like. We do meet with elections officials to talk about ranked choice voting to get them on board, because elections officials are the ones that do implementation, and they are highly important. You have to get them on board to support this effort. So you have to identify who of the elections officials, county level, state level, that you could get to support this. You have to identify who in the legislature, amongst leadership, committee chairs, who you need to get on board to support this. So start the meetings early, talk to them often, talk to their staff often to support this issue.
That sounds a little bit like the power mapping that Sean was talking about. And so when you are breaking this down as far as identifying areas where you can get support and areas where there isn't support? Is this something that you use, like, just like a Google Doc, and you're like, I'm going through this list, right? Who's going to be my supporters? And are you power mapping that way? Or are you, just, do you have this mind map board and you're kind of using sticky notes, like, I'm going to, travel around to different jurisdictions, different districts to figure out how to contact these folks?
Both.
Yeah.
Do both. Yeah.
Okay. Good, good to know. All right, Sean. So Sandy was talking about power mapping. You mentioned it before as well. And so we know that is a tool that you used in the various states that you've worked in for RCV implementation. Are there any additional tools that you think would work for folks?
Definitely. So I would say RCV can sometimes be a little confusing when you're explaining it. So having visuals that folks can see, having interactive tools so that folks can use it. I am going to just for a second briefly share my screen. Go. And so this is our website for the DC campaign for More Voice DC. And we have embedded in it a tool that allows us to do custom monthly mock elections. So our current mock election is rank your favorite holiday tradition. And so folks get to go through the ranking process in real time. Of course, this isn't how you should never rank your ballot. It's just in the shape, but we're going to do it anyway. And then they can see the results in real time and go through the elimination process. And so that is a very cool tool from our friends at rankedvote.co and is included in I think it's a $60 monthly membership. So it's something that's fairly inexpensive that allows you to do multiple campaigns and multiple mock elections, so that as you're presenting to folks, Debbie, I know we used it in New York as well, getting hundreds and hundreds of people to do that is a wonderful tool. And again, it does cost, but it's the only platform that allows you to embed directly into your website, included in that fee. And I found it to be the most visually appealing and understandable for folks. So just a short plug there. There are a whole bunch of additional resources that are available on our website, but also more. In New York, we did everything in 13 languages and large print. Susan stopped us from going to 15, but so if you go to the Rank the Vote NYC website, which is rankthevotenyc.org, it has all of those materials available in 13 different languages that folks can use.
Actually had a coalition partner meeting yesterday where they utilized or reviewed some of our translated materials and also implemented their own. And that is one of the major things. I think that's a really great tool, translating your material so folks can see it before even casting their ballots. They need to be able to see what this looks like in a language that is familiar to them. And so that as a resource is absolutely amazing. Sean, I'm going to actually put you on the spot. Can you drop in the chat the link or a link to any of the mock elections that you have, which will probably help you as well? It gets you some votes on any of your current mock elections. If you can drop it in the chat so folks can really get an idea of what it looks like, and they can participate in the mock election. I know it's a tool that people in New York really loved. Every time we did a presentation, folks were like, are you going to do the election thingy? Right? Never knew what it was called, but it worked because it was an election thingy that people liked. Right? And so if we can drop that in the chat and folks can go ahead and try that out, I think it would be really useful to kind of wrap up this panel session. We're not done yet. I'm just going to answer some questions. I see the chat was moving, which is great. So while Sean gets the link for us and drops it in the chat, I will go through the chat questions and see what we answered, what we didn't answer, and then just do some Q&A. Sandy, I think you addressed Susan's question, right?
Yes, the League of Women Voters here in Hawaii has recently come on board to support ranked choice voting. Yes.
Okay. Um,
I'll add that we work closely with the league here in DC as well. We found them as well as leaders within the NAACP locally to be great allies in this work.
Yeah, and we work with the league as well in New York City. They're a great partner for us. They're always on time, ready to do the work, and ready to support any initiative that we have in regards to voting. Roxanne made a really good point where she said RCV helps encourage the candidates to not partake in negative campaigning, because if they don't make someone's first choice, they're still working to get their second choice. So thank you so much for that. There's a question from Jonathan. In addition to the states that demonstrate that RCV isn't bad for candidates of color, is there a structural, theoretical argument in terms of how RCV is designed to work in theory that can be used as a response to the concern?
Take a stab at that. I don't think you need to use theoreticals, right? We know it works. So in New York City, there had never been more than 15 women elected at any time to its 51-person city council. After a single RCV election, that number is now 32. And it's overwhelmingly women of color who are in those offices. If you're in a place where communities are changing and gentrification is a thing, like my hometown of Oakland, which is now only 20% African American, yet it has the largest number of Black elected officials at the local level at any time in its recent history. And that's because those people are elected under ranked choice voting. So it doesn't have to be theoretical. I think that's the great thing about where RCV is now. Anything that the opposition throws out, we have stats, we have actual data to combat it. And so it really just brings their arguments down to an emotional level. And of course, you have to be careful with emotion and meet emotion with emotion, but we also have the stats and figures to back up our emotional argument in support of RCV.
Thank you for that. Sandy, do you have anything to add?
RCV is only used in Hawaii by the Democratic Party preferential preference poll. So it's only used in one place here. So we don't really have any statistics for RCV in Hawaii in practice.
Thank you. Then Roxanne dropped chat, which I think is really useful, rankit.vote, as a free tool to use for some polls. So thank you so much for that, Roxanne. And we have a few additional links that are being dropped in the chat that you all can take a look at. One thing I want to note is favorite holiday tradition mock election link that Sean dropped in the chat. So if you all want to go ahead and participate in that, Sean, I guess you can track the numbers to see how it increased. But if you want to participate in that, it's quick. It shouldn't take you more than a minute. And you can go ahead and participate in that mock election. Mike has a question. Do you have a FAQ resource stats page to address the pushback?
So I just dropped a link in the chat that addresses a lot of the concerns that have been brought up. It's our RCV in action section. And so it has the testimonial video from Common Cause New York of new NYC voters after the primary there. It has candidates and elected officials from the Bay Area talking about their experience with RCV. It has links to articles in New York and Minneapolis and Las Cruces, all of which promote the most diverse city councils they've ever had, as well as it has links to 2 studies, one that was done by Fair Vote about how RCV impacts candidates and voters of color, and then one from Represent Women on how RCV impacts women as candidates and as voters. The other thing I would just note is under our FAQs, we have, I believe, 60 FAQs there that cover a wide range of things, and you can use that as something to draw from. It's a little bit more New York or DC specific, but it does cover some general messaging as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And I think this is our last question. So in the Wisconsin legislature yesterday, we had a hearing about Final 5 voting, open top 5 primaries, and RCV general elections. Can you please discuss how these changes empower independent voters?
I think that actually might be a question for the next group.
Okay. All right, so we'll take
Unless
this.
Sandy has a.
I just want to add that it's also highly important to talk to the editorial boards of newspapers to get them to support ranked choice voting, to just lay the groundwork. So we've been doing that a lot in Hawaii, talking to editorial boards. We're an island state, so we have to, talk to the editorial boards of the different island newspapers, and to make sure that all the islands are on board with ranked choice voting and understand how it could benefit the populations of each island, and how it can make sense and how it could work, and not let the the naysayers get a foothold and get that messaging out first. So having the editorial boards understand the benefits is highly important. So it's coalition building, legislative support, elections officials, and also editorial boards. It's all of it at once.
Thank you so much for that. Sean, I got another question. Can you please break down power mapping? Just give it a little bit more detail on how to structure it and how to do it.
Or you could just come to my breakout group a little bit later and go through a power mapping exercise. But essentially, power mapping is looking at brainstorming who the power players are. So who may be supportive, who may be in opposition, who's on the fence, who has actual power, who has theoretical power, who are the folks that you may not think of as power players, but still have influence. So it's really just a process of brainstorming. And I'm going to take a point of personal privilege. I think she's still here. Grace Ramsey and the Democracy Rising folks do great power mapping sessions. So as does Debbie. So both of them are resources that I hope folks will take advantage of.
Yeah, power mapping is one of my favorite things to do, especially with learning or understanding the landscape, the political landscape, and where your stakeholders are. And like Sean said, in his breakout group for later, you'll actually do an activity where you'll see how to power map and how to place people in certain quadrants so that you know how strong those supporters are and where they may be leaning and how to now navigate persuasion tactics. Okay, so the final question, will there be a recording of this event? Yes, there will be. And so we'll figure out how to share that out. And Sean dropped a couple links. So Sean, before we go ahead and take a quick break before we transition to the next panel, did that mock election move for us at all? Or do you want to share it really quickly?
Got 6 votes, so not a lot has changed.
Okay.
You all still have time. You can go
Yeah.
through the practice.
Yeah. So if you give it, take a minute and just go ahead and let's drop that again for them so you can participate in this mock election before we move to the next panel so you can visually see how it works. And then we'll do this right before we go into panel session number 2. So let's take about a minute and then we will reconvene with this mock election. And Sean and Sandy, I want to thank you both so much for really, sharing a lot of great information, tools, and resources with us today and making sure that we understand not just how to gain RCV in our respective states, but also how to properly prepare for those conversations that we need to have, and knowing if it's even possible for bring RCV into our jurisdiction. So thank you so much for that. Sandy, do you have any final comments before we do the mock election and then head out to the next panel session?
Thank you for having us. Happy to be here to talk about ranked choice voting. This is just a first step for us. Hopefully we will get the limited RCV bill passed and then move on to more RCV elections in Hawaii. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, Sean, let's see where we are.
All right, so we have gotten a number of folks participating. Give it one more refresh. All right, we're still at the same number. So we've had 31 votes cast in this mock election. In the first round, we see that no one has hit that threshold of 16 votes. So that's 50% plus 1. That's needed to win. We see Go to the Holiday Market leading with 5 votes. We see the Zoo Lights at the Smithsonian, visiting Union Station, watching the National Christmas Tree Lighting, and visiting the National Gallery Sculpture Garden, tied with 4 votes each. The City Center Tree Lighting and Ice Skating at Washington Harbor are tied with 3 votes each. And then the lowest vote getters are the Candlelight in Mount Vernon and visiting the tree in the Library of Congress. So again, under ranked choice voting, as I'm sure you all know, the candidate with the lowest number of votes, there we go, is eliminated first. In this instance, tracking the journey of the Capitol tree has 0 votes, so it's eliminated first. Next is the tied candidates. So the Candlelight and the tree at the Library of Congress are eliminated, and their votes are redistributed to whoever those voters chose as their next choice. So we see Union Station, the National Christmas Tree Lighting, and the Sculpture Garden picking up votes. Still no activity has reached that threshold of 50% plus 1. So we continue the process of eliminating the lowest vote getter and those votes being redistributed until we reach this result. So this, because there are a number of exhausted votes, only 6 of them, but it is a number. no one has reached that threshold of 50% plus one. We actually see that going to the holiday market ends up winning with 48% of the vote. So still an overwhelming majority. And this only happens with small mock elections. But I'm sure we'll see a winner at 50% plus one as we get further, as we continue to grow in the number of votes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean. Again, appreciate you and Sandy. Do you have any final thoughts before we prepare for panel session number 2?
No, just thank you all for hosting this. And thanks to everyone for participating. Hope to see you in the breakout groups soon.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Now we will have our second panel. And I will read their bios before I invite them up to the stage. We have with us Mario Jimenez, the campaign director for Common Cause New Mexico, and a former election administrator. During his nearly 17-year involvement in elections, Mario served New Mexico voters in various capacities. Among other positions, he served as the chief deputy county clerk, where he was directly involved with crafting, drafting, and implementation of election-related legislation. He has twice successfully elected by fellow New Mexico county clerks to the position of president of the county clerk's affiliate. He joined Common Cause New Mexico in 2020 and has helped Las Cruces and Santa Fe continue to use RCV successfully. We also have Susan Lerner, the executive director of Common Cause New York. Susan is the chair of Rank the Vote NYC, the project of Common Cause New York, which helps to successfully pass and then implement ranked choice voting for New York City's 2021 primary and special elections. And our third panelist is Becky Stern, who's the Director of Communications at Pathia Public Affairs. Becky joined Pathia Public after almost 3 years as a staffer to a New York City council member. She helped to craft and implement the successful communication strategy that helped to pass and then successfully implement RCV in New York City. And I've had the pleasure of working with both Becky and Susan, and the pleasure of speaking and working with Mario over the past few weeks to prepare for this event today. And so I would like to invite Becky, Mario, and Susan up to the stage. Hey there.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you for having us.
It's so good to see your faces. You seem like you're ready to go.
Absolutely. I'll go ahead and I'll just dive right in. I'll be focusing on building voter education campaigns and the reporting of results, both of which I'll dive in more as we get into our breakout sessions. Now, my colleague, Sandy from Hawaii did a great job at diving into some of this already, so she stole a little bit of my thunder, but we'll go ahead and emphasize some of the areas on voter education. More specifically, as she was talking about reaching out to the election administrators, that is an extremely important process of implementing ranked choice voting in your community or in your state. It's definitely important to have buy-in from those who are conducting the elections and making sure that they themselves understand the process of ranked choice voting. And one of the main reasons that is so important is, at the end of the day, these are the people who are trusted with the information of conducting elections. So an individual is going to take an election administrator's word over an organization or somebody knocking on doors pushing an issue a lot stronger than they are going to be taking ours, right? So it's very important that those election administrators fully understand how ranked choice voting is used and how the counting of those votes is accepted in through those machines, and those results reported out to the general community. That way, they are prepared to assist you in answering those questions and educating the public. One of the other important parts is getting your Secretary of States involved. If establish relationships with the administration of your Secretary of State's office. Establish a relationship with the individuals in the clerk's affiliates within your state who are in a leadership position. Those are the individuals who are going to be disseminating information to other county clerks and educating them of different ways that voting is taking place across the country, and therefore educating them and trickling it down to educating the general public. Another great thing, a great resource in education, is utilizing your local communities as well as your state's public regulation. Your public relations departments. Those public relations departments and forming a relationship with those individuals is key to educating your public within your community about how ranked choice voting is used, and creating those relationships so you can put out information jointly and educating that public, making you yourself, your organization, a trusted resource for obtaining information about ranked choice voting. So by establishing those connections, that uplifts you and your organization's voices in the education process of ranked choice voting. Another very, very important individual that you all need to reach out to locally as well as within your state is, of course, your media relations. Sandy touched on this briefly as well. Reach out to your editorial boards. Find out who your reporter is that is working the beat on election or local government or state government issues. Establish those relationships early on. Explain to them how ranked choice voting works. Educate them on ranked choice voting before they even write their first story. You want to make sure that the first story that hits print is accurate. And if it's something that they themselves do not understand, they cannot disseminate the information to the general public and help them understand the process itself. So that very first article that hits the paper, that is reported on the radio or even on camera, that information needs to be accurate, and get them other resources as well. Send them to websites like Sean has mentioned, like Sandy has mentioned. Here in New Mexico, we started a website which is freshly up and running as of August of this year for educating the general public here in New Mexico, which I and myself have been directing in Common Cause, and many of our partner organizations have been directing people to find information on how ranked choice voting works. The education process is something that does not stop at the organization level. This is something that we need to continue to advocate for and continue to push throughout an election, between elections, and even when there are not any elections or campaigns taking place. Any time that we have change in our election process, there is going to be conspiracy theories. There is going to be fear of change. People are used to voting in the way that they've been voting for the past 2 to 20 to 50 years. And that's how they want to do it in a repetitive manner. So sometimes that change is hard. That is why the education process of ranked choice voting, how it's going to change their community, how it's going to improve the electoral process, and ultimately how it's going to make sure that the person taking office is elected by a true majority, is important to continue to educate that throughout the entire year, whether we have an election taking place, a campaign taking place, or not. By befriending our media outlets, we can work on having whether it be a bi-monthly or a quarterly article explaining to the general public on how ranked choice voting works. Have your local administrators have links to trustworthy websites, or help them create a page of their own, educating people on ranked choice voting. Have your Secretary of State's office work closely with yourselves in developing printouts, developing examples, just as Sean showed us and demonstrated for us on a website, where people can see how ranked choice voting is utilized. In addition to our media, it's also very important we use our social media platforms. This is something that has proven to be, a great resource in connecting and reaching people far and wide. Now, in doing so, it's also important we think outside that box of what about the public who does not have access to broadband? What about those who do not have access to a cell phone where they can see all of this information? That is where reaching out to our community leaders, reaching out to respective individuals in community organizations is key. These individuals are trusted people within their small communities, whether it be a small barrio or whether it be a large community organization. Reach out to those community leaders, have one-on-one sit downs, teleconferences, however you can meet with them in a safe manner, considering the pandemic that we're dealing with right now, and educate them on ranked choice voting and have them disseminate that information further down. This is where handouts, visuals, like was mentioned earlier by Sean, is very important. Have some card printouts, have some one-pagers to give them a visual on how ranked choice voting works, to disseminate amongst their community, to have those coffee meetings that may happen once a week or bi-weekly. A lot of these luncheons that happen from within these small communities, it's important to have as much information, as many resources with good, accurate information to disseminate to continue to educate our public. Anytime, as I mentioned, we go to a change, there's fear of change. The candidates have fear of change because, as mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if I'm going to get elected again under this new model. I want the status quo where I know I can keep winning. But this is where we need to educate those individuals who are seeking office or in office as well, of how ranked choice voting benefits their community. Remind them that they have been elected by their community to serve their community. And this is a process of voting that is going to strengthen their community, not hurt their community. Again, education is extremely key in that process. Now, when it comes to reporting of results, again, a very, very important topic that you all need to focus on in having the discussions of ranked choice voting. How are these results counted? Anytime there's a change in counting results, there's immediate fear that somebody is pushing a button from somewhere, or somebody is making election changes, or there's a sleight of hand with the results. Well, that is simply not true with ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is not going to delay the results of the election. It's something that you cannot have a sleight of hand with the results. Here in New Mexico, we utilize paper ballots. And by doing so, whether we're utilizing ranked choice voting, top two runoff, or traditional fashion of voting, you can always go back, remove those paper ballots, and audit each and every single one of those and come to the exact number of votes that took place while the machines were counting them. In fact, here in New Mexico today, we have a great article about a few races where we had ties. We had tie votes, and during the audit process, it proved that those votes that were counted by the machine were true. There wasn't a single change in the results. And that is something that we can continue to explain to the general public about how our voting machines work, how the tabulation takes place, and how we have an auditing process that allows the general public, that allows a party, or allows a candidate to seek an audit of a true audit, a unpartisan, unbiased audit, to audit those results. Now, in educating of how the voting process takes place, this is again something that Sean briefly touched on. Your lowest candidate, the candidate with the lowest amount of votes, is then eliminated, and then their secondary votes, if they chose to have that secondary vote, are then disseminated to whoever that individual chose to vote for. So it's good to have these visuals of how that voting process takes place as well. Here at Common Cause New Mexico, we've developed a short 2-minute video on how that actually takes place. And it's something that we've seen on YouTube and others. Matter of fact, the state of New York had a little animation as well showing how those votes are disseminated. showing how those votes are tabulated to help educate individuals on that voting process, not just how to mark your ballot, which is extremely important as well. We need to make sure that as we have a change of any kind of election reform or any kind of democracy reform, we're educating how that change is going to take place. Here in small Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is, our second largest city in the state, but, small in comparison to New York. And speaking to a lot of individuals utilizing ranked choice voting for their first time, they're very wary of it and immediately said, I didn't like it because I have to think about, different choices. I have to add different choices. But once you're able to sit down with an individual and explain to them the benefits of ranked choice voting, immediately that mindset changed to, wow, this is great. I love it. I wish I would have understood it more prior to walking into that ballot booth. Now, again, this is where education is key. Here in Las Cruces, we also did an exit poll during that first ranked choice voting election to see where people got their information from. How were you educated about ranked choice voting? Was it through social media? Was it through traditional media, radio ads? We had a slew of different questions on that. And the vast majority of people use traditional print media. So it's very important that we do not bypass that traditional print media and go to social media. Because as mentioned earlier, we still have a large demographic of individuals who do not have access to that social media platform or simply just do not use them due to the fact that we have seen a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and quite frankly, lies about the electoral process. So it's very important that we think outside the box and use multiple avenues in reaching the general public and educating them about how ranked choice voting takes place, how the votes are tabulated, and ultimately the benefits of ranked choice voting.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Mario. That in-depth explanation about ranked choice voting, voter education campaigns, and results. I am going to kick it over to Becky, but before I do that, you spoke about putting out joint material. Can we find examples of that on the website for New Mexico or Las Cruces?
Well, what we have done most recently is we have worked with our two municipalities who currently utilize ranked choice voting and encourage them to place links to our website, which is unbiased, unpartisan. And one of them has chosen to do so. The other one wanted to wait until they got word from City Council. I worked with our Secretary of State's office, and our state Secretary of State's office has also put a link to our rcvnm.org, which I've dropped in the chat for those who are interested in taking a look at as well. And we're continuing to build out that website and taking information from our elected officials, from our election administrators, and our partner organizations. In fact, right now we're in the process of building out a section for candidates. That way candidates can understand the importance of, ranked choice voting, but also suggestions on how they should run their campaigns. As I believe it was Sean that mentioned earlier, you want to encourage them to ask for that second, that third vote, that fourth vote, to try to help tamper, election tempers, by asking for that second vote rather than attacking my somebody who may be running against me. I have a chance at that second vote rather than turning voters away. So these are all things that we are looking at building into our existing website and also working with administrators to uplift as well.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And that really plays into the messaging that Becky has helped us develop in New York City. I'm saying us because I'm part of the New York City team. And, I think it's key to understand what exactly, what terms and keywords you can use exactly for candidates, campaigns, for legislators, for press and media. And so I'm going to kick it over to Becky so she can talk a little bit more about messaging and message discipline. and how to neutralize opposition with messaging.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. Hi, everyone. I'm Becky, and I was part of the communications team for Rank the Vote NYC, and I've been working with Common Cause for about 4 years. So implementing ranked choice voting, as we've all spoken about, can be a massive messaging challenge in big jurisdictions like New York City. As I'm sure you all know, New York is a very large and diverse place. So it required a big affirmative push to voters. And then we also tackled a lot of misdirection from our opponents. So I'm going to walk you guys through sort of what we did and how we pushed our affirmative while also tackling. So in New York City, we had 4 special elections in 2021 where a small section of voters could experience ranked choice voting before the big mayoral election. So with that, in order to get ahead of that and to produce positive press, we hosted forums with local reporters and candidates that focused on choice voting especially, so we could get the candidates on the record to talk about positive experiences that they had with ranked choice voting, which produced media hits because they were moderated by local reporters. We wrote op-eds for local partners, such as the Queens NAACP. We placed that in local press, so that way we controlled the narrative of what came out. And we also conducted our own exit polling, which was in line with our own affirmative messaging. So I want to show you guys a release that we did, and that was in March of 2021. Let me, sorry, 1 second. This technology is new to me. Okay. That worked, right? Okay, great. So here you can see this press release that we put out, and it was right after the special elections happened, and it had our exit poll, which so that we continue doing was highlighting the voter experience. So you can see here, this all is the message discipline is to talk about the voter and how ranked choice voting gives people more choice and more voice when they head to the polls. And also to punch back on the people who are criticizing ranked choice voting, it shows that the ballot is simple, that our education efforts were working, people knew about it. And this gave real hard data to push back on people who were saying ranked choice voting was too confusing or people don't know about it. This showed that that was simply not true. Okay, I should be out of that. All right, perfect. Sorry, guys. So as you can see, our messaging always focused on the voter experience, but it wasn't just voters who we had who carried that message. We partnered with nonprofits from across the city, including Dominicanos, local NAACPs, unions, et cetera, who also carried our same message. And we also, one of the great things about what happening in New York City at the time was that we had a lot of candidates, first-time candidates who are running for election in city council. So we worked with a lot of those candidates who stood to benefit from ranked choice voting because they realized that the type of coalition partnership is something that would lead them to win their election. So we equipped them with a lot of messaging and had them push back to the same opposition that we were hearing. And I want to show you also now a release from a kickoff. Oh, did someone say they couldn't see it? Sorry, I just saw that. I'll put these in the chat too, which is probably easier. Sorry about that. Here is I'll share my screen, but here is a press conference that we did in early April. That was 60 days before the election. And we partnered with folks running for comptroller as well as mayoral candidates who carried our positive affirmative message. And also, I think what's important with messaging about ranked choice voting is we had a very big coalition and we hammered that point home because we would get a lot of pushback from folks who would say, oh, it's just 2 people or it's just this like good government group that's pushing for this. When it's like, no, it's actually a big coalition of a lot of New Yorkers. And what was crucial was getting these candidates running for office on the same positive ranked choice voting message coalition building. You can see it in there, but also in here. And this also, having candidates carry this message, helped push us with the message that it led to less negative campaigning and prevents the spoiler effect, because we saw actually candidates working together and we made sure to highlight that in our messaging.
Becky, before you continue, when you spoke about coalition and including them in some of the messaging, was that in all of the messaging or key publications or key messages that would go out?
That was in all of our messaging. One thing in New York, we're lucky. We are lucky, and then we have a lot of media, although it's not nearly what it was, 10, 15 years ago. But we do have a lot of papers, and it's not just like the New York Times or like the Wall Street Journal. We have a lot of local and radios who I and my colleague Alexis spent a lot of time talking to those reporters off the record about ranked choice voting, why it was good and why it'll be really critical in our 2021 election, because we saw races where 10 people were running for the seat. So it was easy. It helped because we could use that as a talking point to justify why ranked choice voting would lead to a better democracy. So we also had a lot of those conversations before the campaign really kicked off too. And I know someone mentioned on the other panel about editorial boards, but those are also critical. And we would we have a bunch of papers in the city. So we would have, Susan speak to an editorial board member or even and other members from our coalition, to show broad support for it. So it's not just Susan talking to them, but also as a way to show how it was something that they couldn't ignore. And we had the editorial boards end up pushing in our favor, which was very helpful. And they also editorialized when it was on the ballot in 2019 too. So there was a momentum for a long amount of time too. Does that answer your question, Debbie?
Thank you.
Something else that we did that I'm going to share here in June, what we would do talking about reporters is we put out a press release that highlighted how campaigns look different when using ranked choice voting. And that was helpful because it pointed out for reporters. I will share my screen now, 1 second. Okay. Hopefully you can see that, but it was helpful because it signaled to reporters who are obviously busy and there's a lot going on. That way they could pull for things like, for example, we had 2 people in the mayoral race cross endorse each other as 1 and 2. We saw some candidates, highlighted all of the ways in which candidates were using ranked choice voting correctly. So it would help not only show that like New Yorkers were ready to rank and ready to do all of those things, but also how candidates were adapting and using it. We got a lot of pushback that people didn't know what it was. Campaigns weren't adapting. And this was a way for us to strictly counter that by collecting ways in which, hey, look, a lot of campaigns are actually using ranked choice voting and teaming up too. Of course, implementing ranked choice voting wasn't without its critiques and challenges. We had a small but extremely vocal push from establishment elected officials and candidates, as we've been talking about before, who questioned how easy ranked choice voting was to understand for older folks and for people of color. And to counter that message, again, we pushed the results of our exit memo and centered the first-time candidates and first-time candidates of color, as well as we had Congress members, including Jamal Bowman and Richie Torres, who also carried our message on the federal level, which was super helpful for us. And we held press conferences with them. We issued op-eds to get that message and to control that narrative. And so we were able to tackle it from all sides. And I mentioned the editorial board also being in support. One of the main critiques about ranked choice voting actually happened after Election Day. Which you may be familiar or not with, was that the Board of Elections had a small technical error with our software. And that was honestly our biggest challenge that we came up against. I won't get into that, what happened, but it opened the floodgate for a critique of ranked choice voting, despite it having nothing to do with ranked choice voting, which almost made it a little bit harder because our opponents were using it as a way to be like, this is why we can't have ranked choice voting. But instead, what we did at Common Cause, and because we had credible validators on our side, like the elections chair of the New York State Senate and the public advocate, within 12 hours, we hosted a press conference with them to change the narrative to be about why we need Board of Elections reform in New York and to discredit the folks who were saying that this was because of ranked choice voting. And because of that, we were able to control what happened next and take the heat off of ranked choice voting and onto this greater push that Common Cause has been doing for a very long time about why we need Board of Elections reform here in New York, not the actual problem with ranked choice voting. So my main takeaway, and we can talk about this in breakouts, but what worked for us is to make sure that your message always centers the voter experience. And it's about giving voters more choice and more voice. And that's what our main message was always, that it wasn't about how the candidates would fare, but about the voter, because that's what it was for us. We would push that message out, and it worked, and it was really receptive with a lot of reporters. And it also helps to have credible validators, whether that's elected officials or also local nonprofits who've been doing the work in the community, to also carry that message too with breast.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Becky. Again, if you have any questions you would like answered, you can drop it in the Q&A. There is a question that is lingering, or was lingering, from the previous panel, but I won't ask it now. Susan, I'll kick it over to you, and then we can go to that question.
Okay, well, thank you. We've covered a lot of ground. Mario went into wonderful detail. I want to drill down in a couple of different areas. I want to pick up on what Sean was saying about the coalition that you put together. The coalition that you put together to help gain ranked choice voting is the coalition that's going to help make it successful in implementation. Let me be very blunt. We, as advocates for ranked choice voting, each and every one of us should look in the mirror and be honest in terms of who are the communities that we are the best messengers for. You look at me and you know that there are certain communities in New York City where I am probably not the strongest messenger. But because we had a broad coalition, we were able to identify spokespeople, we were able to have organizers, we were able to have coalition partners who were the right messengers in those communities. So when we found that there were a limited number of Black council members who resisted ranked choice voting and were, quite frankly, disseminating misinformation and confusion about it, we were able to turn to our partners in the Black community and say, please, can we help you get the message out? Will you do an op-ed? We'll ghost it for you. You can change it to your own voice. We would place them in Black publications, get them on Black radio. We'd set up forums where none of the Common Cause people were speaking. The only people who were speaking were coalition partners, really rank the vote NYC events, and being very strategic, ensuring that questions that came up in the South Asian community were referred to our South Asian partners. And because we are lucky in New York City to be so large and to have such a diverse community, we have a lot of ethnic press. And we were able to work with our coalition partners to be sure that they had the materials and the messaging that they needed to place the right stories in the ethnic press. There is no way I'm going to be able to speak to the Vietnamese community effectively, but we have partners who can. Which leads me to another important part of the education program, which is the challenges and the excitement of translating or transcreating the materials in so many different languages. As Sean said, we have materials in New York City, which we translated into 13 different languages. And look, I was the person who was sitting on the budget. And after a while, I had to say, we've done as much as we can. But let's also be honest that transcreation of materials can be challenging. And just because you have translated your one-pager or your explainer into a language using perhaps a paid translation service, and it's been proofed by one of your community partners, you may find out that there's some controversy within the community as to how you, for instance, say ranked choice voting in Bangla. We actually had an instance where it turned out that the Board of Elections and then the Campaign Finance Board, both agencies, government agencies, where the Board of Elections obviously is running the election and has to communicate with the voters in the polling place, and the Campaign Finance Board, which under our charter has the obligation to put out a voter guide, we're using two different phrases in Spanish to identify ranked choice voting. And one thing that we learned, and that we know from messaging, and that we also learned from our partners, particularly at the Center for Civic Design, is that it's really essential to have a uniform message that's repeated over and over and over again. You may get tired of saying the same things over again, but your audience changes. And if they hear ranked choice voting described in a similar way from you and from the election administrator and from the city PR department or the agencies that are putting out information, and your partners are speaking about ranked choice voting in the same way, then the voter is going to be able to absorb it, because the key is often repetition, as I think we know as people who do a lot of work in trying to communicate with a lot of different people. So getting your coalition on the same page, and frankly, vetting your translated materials with more than one of your partners can save you a lot of trouble. What we ended up doing in the situation around Spanish was we basically, the various Latino groups which brought the issue to us, we said, it's not Rank the Vote that can resolve this. Let's set up a meeting with the two government agencies and you speak directly to them. And there was a three-way meeting and there was a negotiation, and they all agreed to use one phrase, and the government agency that was using a different phrase changed their materials so that the Latino community saw the same name for ranked choice voting. Another thing that we found, and that you probably will run into in any jurisdiction, is that there will be a lot of concern, as Mario pointed out, for people who may not be online. And particularly, we found elected officials are very sensitive to the senior community. And we know why that is, because seniors generally turn out and vote in large numbers. They're also very vocal and hesitant about changes. So one of the things that we found very important and useful in our education program was, frankly, to go out of our way to figure out how are we going to communicate with seniors. So all of our translated paper material, our one-page explainer, is in regular print, but also in large type as well for distribution to senior voters. And we formed alliances with Meals on Wheels and with food banks and with agencies that deliver meals and other supplies to homebound individuals, many of whom are seniors, and ensured that we did training sessions for the volunteers in those organizations. And we provided tens of thousands of copies of the basic explainer material, so that in the weeks leading up to the election, the housebound seniors who were receiving these services were getting printed information about ranked choice voting in the appropriate language from a trusted messenger. The last thing I'd like to say, and reinforcing what Mario said, is that your relationship with your election administrators is absolutely key to successful implementation. And what we found was most helpful was being able to introduce our New York City election administrators to experts like the Center for Civic Design, and to election administrators in other jurisdictions who have conducted ranked choice voting elections, who could answer the questions that the New York City administrators had from firsthand experience. In my experience, they weren't saying anything different to the election administrators than we at Rank the Vote or Common Cause or any of our partners would say, having spoken to those same election administrators and having talked to our colleagues in all of those jurisdictions about how things worked and what needed to be in the polling place, what the ballots looked like. But nothing substitutes a level of comfort for an election administrator than hearing from another election administrator. So a lot of our role was simply being an introducer. It was being the connection and helping our election administrators know where to go to have their questions answered, which then increased their comfort with ranked choice voting and also increased their willingness to work with us, where we focus very much, as Becky said, not just in the messaging, but actually in the implementation in terms of what was the voter experience going to be like. Working directly with the board's communication people to ensure that there was adequate and clear information that was going to be present at the polling places, and frankly, having direct conversations about the layout of the ballot, which I cannot overemphasize enough. At the end of the day, if the ballot is not clear and well laid out, it doesn't matter what we're saying to voters, some of them will get lost. And we now have enough experience across the country to have some basic guidelines, right? We know that that setting the ballot out in a grid is very, very helpful. There are good resources, the Center for Civic Design on its website, the RCV Resource Center on its website provides a lot of information on some of these basic design issues, which are easy for us to overlook, but absolutely essential for a successful voter experience. And the last thing I'd like to say is that we conceptualized our education program as having three distinct, equally important parts. And that is education from the jurisdiction, that New York City had to be providing information directly to the voters, that there needed to be direct voter education with our partners, with the trusted messengers. But third, and Mario touched on this and Becky touched on this a little bit, that educating the candidates and the campaigns was our initial and first voter education effort. Often there's hopefully a decent amount of time between when ranked choice voting is first passed and adopted to when it's actually implemented. In our experience, there was a year in between when it was adopted and when it was going to be used, actually almost a year and a half, with a presidential election in the middle. And we knew we weren't going to get a lot of attention from voters about what was going to happen in the June 21 city primary if we were talking to them in May or September of 2020. But what we did recognize was that the people who wanted to run in those city races were paying attention at that point. And we started our education effort, frankly, training candidates and campaign workers, employees and volunteers. What's RCV? How do you use it in your campaign? And how do you talk to voters? Because the one thing that absolutely happens in any campaign, even during the pandemic, is that candidates and their campaigns find ways to communicate directly with voters. And if the candidates aren't explaining how RCV works, then a lot of the voters may not find out about it until they get into the voting booth. And so having hundreds of candidates, because in New York we had 500 candidates running, but we trained over 200 candidates and campaigns. And knowing that the campaigns incorporate ranked choice voting, and frankly, it's good for the candidates. If their campaign is the campaign that's really informed voters about ranked choice voting, and they've made a solid connection with the voters, which can be very positive for the campaign. So we spent time and energy and resources training candidates, and we heard back from voters that often the first time they heard about ranked choice voting was from a campaign, and that was helpful. So a three-part approach to be sure that we get the word out as far as we can. And I've talked enough.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was really, really helpful, especially emphasizing the three-prong approach. I know, Mario, you dropped something in the chat with to insert.
Lovely.
Yeah, well, it was mentioned, Meals on Wheels is a great idea, and I agree, Susan, that's a phenomenal thing to utilize. But we also worked, and I was planning on mentioning this in the breakout session, but it came up, so I dropped it in the chat. We worked with our local utilities departments because everybody's going to check their bill; they got to pay it, and so we worked with them to have something distributed to those who are not only receiving the paper utility statements, but also those who have asked and opted out from receiving those and getting those via email. So there were electronic copies that were being sent out to everyone as well as an insert. So that we're trying to touch and reach as many people as possible. There's one other thing that I did want to add, and Susan touched on it, fantastically by working with the administrators, but also make sure that the language being used is tied to the exact same language that our administrators are using as well, right? Like she said, they were able to come to a consensus to have, the government agency change the language, which is phenomenal. So as you're explaining different types of voting, I'll use absentee voting as a great example. Some people refer to it as absentee. Some people refer to it as voting by mail. Make sure you're using that same message that your election administrators are using to make sure that that message does not get lost.
Great. Thank you so much. Any final thoughts from you all before we jump into questions? Okay. There was a question before. In the Wisconsin legislature yesterday, we had a hearing about Final Five voting, open top 5 primaries, and RCV general elections. Can you please discuss how these changes empower independent voters?
So, we're going to see how it works out now that it has been adopted in Alaska. But I think that the idea is that, and the goal is to unmoor the primary and selection process from party domination and to open up the ballot to a greater diversity of candidates, but also to invite more voters in to a much more expansive selection process. So rather than having a closed primary or even an open primary, when you've got all of the candidates running together and any voter can participate choosing the top 5, that really, I think, allows independent candidates and possibly third parties to play more of a role.
Awesome. I hope that answered your question, Mike. Let's see. There's something else in the chat. We're sort of following Susan's strategy in Connecticut as candidates announced for running for Secretary of the state next year. Most of the Democratic candidates are RCV supporters and some currently legislators, and they're talking about it because we've cultivated relationships with them all along. Reopen primaries, how do you respond to critique that it's not fair for non-party members to participate in choosing the party's candidate? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I don't know that we're necessary. Mario, you've come off mute. Do you have a, what have you got in New Mexico? Because we have primaries in New York.
So really the only comment that I have regarding open primaries is, that is another conversation in its own. Ranked choice voting, of course, is used in many areas, small elections, party elections, private party elections, as well as, as we're seeing happen in large state elections. But open primaries is definitely a larger, another conversation that, I think we should save for another time rather than confusing the two of ranked choice voting and open primaries.
And one other question, what are a few, I guess maybe 2 or 3 key phrases that have definitely worked for messaging? I'm guessing this is a Becky question, or maybe Susan, either or. Oh,
Sorry, I
so
had to step away because someone was at my door. What was the question?
what are a few key phrases that may have worked for messaging? Because we spoke about repetition,
Yes.
using the same key phrases. So, what are maybe 2 or 3 phrases or keywords that worked?
More choice, more voice is what we used in New York, and it's what we message tested. And any variation of that is what I think that is easiest for voters to understand and people who are reading. Because ranked choice voting can get really in the weeds, but the clearer you are on like ranked choice voting gives you more voice and more choice is the best message that I suggest and recommend that you just keep pounding home.
Choice, voter's choice. It's the voter's choice, right? And it answers so many different questions, right? We get questions, do I have to vote for more than one? The answer is it's the voter's choice. How many do I rank? You can rank up to 5. It's the voter's choice, right? And so it's just, and it resonates in voter empowerment. And frankly, voters like that. They like to be empowered.
Yeah, when local papers here like the Times and like Gothamist, WNYC love to do the man on the street story about ranked choice voting, and often it was positive because voters who we don't know but they got off the street would say, "I like ranked choice voting because it gave me more choice when I went to the ballot box and I didn't have to choose between Eric Adams or Catherine Garcia. I got to vote for both of them."
One more on messaging. So, as it relates to tabulation, where should this conversation happen? Should you be discussing this with everyone, or should it be in specific communities? And what messaging would you use for tabulation questions?
I have a suspicion Mario and I may come out in slightly different places on this from what he said earlier.
Go ahead, Susan. I'll let you take that first. I'll let you and Becky take a stab at it, then I'll jump in if needed.
I think Susan and I even disagree, as I think this conversation should not happen, period, because it is confusing to voters, especially, and it's not confusing, but it ends up becoming more confusing. The tool that Sean sent is very helpful at explaining and visualizing what the tabulation process looks like. I found in my off-the-record conversations with reporters, I would often send that to them because that's what they would get hung up on it, and I would have to redirect it to being, it's not about the tabulation. That'll get done and taken with the technology that we have. Of course, we had a technological problem, which led to, going back to the tabulation discussion. But again, we tried to, and I think rather successfully pivoted away from that. But Susan, I don't know if you have anything different to add. That's strictly for press. I think Susan can talk to you more about the messaging with nonprofits and et cetera, and coalition members.
We made a deliberate decision to emphasize the voter experience in introducing RCV, right? Because we're talking about the first time it's being used in a gigantic jurisdiction. And we kept emphasizing the voter's choice and how you make that choice and what the ballot was going to look like, and the benefits of ranking more than one candidate. And we talked briefly, but not in great detail, about the tabulation process. We did, maybe 1 or 2 animation slides, and we got off it. Because for most voters, they want to know how it's going to impact their experience, and the ins and outs of the rounds and the algorithms, the calculations are often just voters just glaze over. So in most public presentations, we touched it very lightly and we emphasized the experience of voting. The tool that Sean showed everybody was really helpful. Passing out actual sample ballots, which we did before we had the tool. And back in 2020, we were actually going to debate watch parties for the presidential debates and passing out paper ballots. And we'd be standing at the door and say, we're going to have a ranked choice voting election at the end for who should be the nominee for president. And people would say ranked choice voting, and I'd hand them the sample ballot and they go, "Oh, all right, I get it, no problem," right? So emphasizing the voter experience and picking who we talk to about the tabulation, because there's always going to be one smart guy in the back who wants to get hung up. Well, I understand that the algorithm doesn't do blah, blah, blah. And I was like, fabulous point. Let's talk about it offline and separate that guy before we lost the vast majority of people who would come away thinking this is way confusing. Whereas the ballot is straightforward and easy to understand. So that's what we emphasized.
And I think we often said, you still have one vote, right? Where someone tried to come in and trip up the conversation, it's still one vote, right? You don't get 5 votes. And I think that was one of the key messaging that helped us as well there.
Mhm. Yeah, so my answer is really no different than Susan's. I mean, it's literally the same. Very basic. I mean, what it comes down to is read the room, right? Know your audience. As we were talking about earlier, it's important to get election administrators on board. The administrators care about the administrative process. How are the machines going to work? If I'm brand new to this, I've never seen a machine tabulate ranked choice voting. I've never seen the accumulation of the results. As an administrator, I want to know how it's going to affect me doing my job and doing my job accurately for the public. These are the individuals you want to bring in, experts on that. I'll give a great example. Just recently, last week, I had a conversation where the municipality gave a very brief overview of ranked choice voting, how it works, didn't go into great detail of the results. However, back in June, I had a conference with the vast majority of our county clerks. All were present. Their staff was present. Their election administrators were also present. So I brought in our voting machine contractor with the state of New Mexico, who happens to be Dominion, just as New York. I brought Dominion in person. I had them provide a presentation as well, side by side with me, on how the tabulation process works. So know your audience, know what is important to provide them with, but also when you're talking to your general public, as mentioned, focus on the issue of more choice, right? Gives them a larger voice, as mentioned. And administrators, you're going to have to dive in those weeds to give them the confidence that this is something that is going to work for them and ultimately work for the general public.
So
read the room.
We had a really weird experience in so many ways in New York City, because in the process, New York has a very rigorous certification process, which had never had to deal with a freestanding piece of tabulation software. And so it ended up being a more attenuated process to get through the certification than anybody expected. And as a result, we had some special elections early in 2021 before the tabulation software had been certified, and therefore could not be used for the official certification of the results. And what the board had to do was actually to hand count the ballots, which ended up having a unexpected silver lining, which is you actually saw the physical process of the transfer from one candidate to another between the rounds. And it was fascinating to me, the observers who were there for candidates and for various political clubs and activists. In the middle of the process, somebody who hadn't been there came in to the count up in the Bronx, where they're in the middle of doing the hand count, and said, I'm not sure I follow this. And one of the women who had been sitting there on behalf of a candidate turned around and said, actually, it's very simple, and described exactly what they were doing to ascertain the first round and then how the votes transferred between candidates and how it was ultimately compiled. And you actually got to physically see that. As a consequence, I think the New York City Board of Elections has a better understanding of the tabulation process than they would have had if they'd been able to use the software from the beginning, where they just pushed a button and they got a whole bunch of spreadsheets. They had to think through, how are we going to do this by hand? I do not recommend it, on the other hand, as a process.
Awesome. One, I guess, fire round question before we go into a quick break. Once RCV is implemented, what is the first thing you should do? It passed, you're ready to go. What is the first thing you should do?
I would say be sure that your election administrators are getting ready and have the information and the connections to the experts that they need.
Mario?
Because there's a long run up to get ready.
Yeah, I would concur. You know, those your election I mentioned earlier, it's very important your election administrators are educated on how ranked choice voting works top to bottom. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to be receiving the emails, the phone calls, the in-person visits from the voters asking those important questions. And it's important that they are on message with everything else that has been disseminated leading up to the adoption of ranked choice voting. And ultimately, they're going to be the trusted source of information for the election process as it continues. So definitely administrators are key.
Yeah, they're going to have to decide, what does the ballot look like? How are they going to describe ranked choice voting on the ballot or in materials that are, I mean, we had 5-foot banners describing how you vote your ranked choice voting ballot in polling places in New York City, which was great. And they put the instructions on the privacy sleeve that every voter gets the ballots tucked into the privacy sleeve. So there was a lot of thinking about what they needed to do to prepare. And so they started far in advance. And I think that was really important. The second thing is figure out your education plan.
And Becky, do you agree? Do you have something else you think would be key first?
No, I totally agree. I think also assuming in your campaign you have this supporters, making sure the supporters that were there when you passed to pass it are also there to help you implement it, and making sure that they're armed with the right talking points for when they talk to press or reporters or editorial boards, et cetera, or even to people in their community about ranked choice voting. And having their support early on will help you to be able to use them to fight off opponents and negative responses.
Yeah, keep your coalition together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the coalition is something, I'll tell you.
It's the voice of experience from Debbie Lewis.
Okay, so we have concluded our first two panels, and we are going to go into breakout sessions. Before we do, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We've been on here for 2 hours, and so it's been a fun 2 hours. And so how this will work, well, first let me do this. On the top right hand of your screen on the remote link, you'll see a little thing that looks like a calendar that gives you the agenda if you haven't seen it already. And so we're going to jump into a 5-minute break, and then we're going to go into breakout rooms. We were going to go into breakout rooms in Zoom, but I think we're small enough to stay on this platform. Susan, I don't know if you agree.
I think we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, we are. We had a big sign up, and not everybody can make it. So yeah, we could stay here and just assign by table.